Hello and welcome to episode 16 of the Follycast, the Rivers of London podcast. I'm Margaret in Sutton and joining me are
Richard in Fulham
and Jan in Worcester.
So the plan for this episode is to discuss the two most recent novellas in the Rivers of London series by Ben Aronovich, namely Winter's Gifts and The Masquerades of Spring. So something of a double header with two very different types of books, although they do both share the USA as their location.
But before we dive into the novellas, regular listeners will hopefully know that in our last episode, Margaret and I interviewed Ben himself, who was very generous with his time, and I was quite relieved that he said he doesn't really listen to fan feedback. So that does mean we can continue to say what we think without his ears burning. Sadly, though, Jan, you weren't able to join us for the interview as you're on holiday, but what did you make of the interview? Any particular insights or information that stood out?
Well, I just liked how honest Ben was about the way he writes and the way he the characterization. And he seems so single-minded and so enjoys the world he inhabits with the rivers that he almost doesn't care what people think. He obviously knows how popular they've been because of the numbers of sales, but I like the fact that he just seems so in control of it all and so immersed in the world in which he inhabits, which I guess is why those of us that are fans, like the book so much.
Yeah, it's not a chore for him, is it? He definitely loves doing it.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Let's dive into the novellas. They are the final two books in a four-book series that was commissioned broadly around the theme of the four seasons, but don't have Peter as the narrator. So we have What Abigail Did That Summer, which we reviewed in episode 11, The October Man, which we reviewed in episode 10. So now Winter and Spring are covered off by these two novellas, which are both set in the USA. Controversially, we're going to spin this around. I'm going to suggest that we start with The Masquerades of Spring first, which came out just a month ago, as this may be fresher in people's minds.
Obviously, if you haven't read it, a quick spoiler warning, as we will be diving into plot details and revelations, so you may want to put this podcast aside until you have listened to both books. But in Masquerades, just to remind the people, although it was fairly recent, so in Masquerades, we travel back to 1920s New York. Our narrator is the wonderfully named Augustus Berrycloth Young. Gussie, for short, is something of a prodigal son for the Folly, as his use of magic for jolly japes has led to his self-enforced exile in New York. His practitioner past catches up with him as his schoolmate and former colleague Nightingale shows up. He's in search of the truth behind enchanted musical instruments, and their search leads us to explore Manhattan and Long Island. Along the way, we've got insights into the jazz world, the practicalities of race relations, and sexual identity in that era. We also learn that Nightingale's mission is driven by his friendship with Molly, and it's no surprise that the Fae are involved. The story culminates in an exciting showdown at the Masquerade Ball at the Roxy Ballroom in New York. Okay, so let's go with our initial impressions. Slightly different way of asking the question this time. So if you could sum up your feelings, Margaret, about Masquerades in two words, what would those words be?
I think it's quite a romp. And then also, I was probably just going to say it's two words. I was just going to say New York. It's very much about the city as well and about what's going on at the time in the jazz age. And as you say, about Harlem and about Prohibition, and I get a real sense of place in that it really is New York is part of the whole story in itself. So that's two words for the second one.
Or Manhattan. Although it does veer off.
No, it goes up to Long Island, so you can't say that. It goes up to Long Island, so you can't say that.
True. Jan, what about you?
Well, this was right up my street because it's very much in a city I absolutely adore. And so going back to 1920s New York. So like you, Margaret, I'd thought New York, but very much, I think the jazz age, really. I think because of all the sort of fun and gaiety, despite all the sort of issues underlying the story, you'd still got that jollity and the life that inhabited the whole book. And I think loyalty, because I think Gussie had escaped London because he hadn't quite behaved himself to this new world, and really found the arrival of Nightingale a bit unwelcome, but nothing was going to stop him supporting him in what he wanted to achieve in New York. And I think loyalty permeates the whole book with the various relationships that are going on there.
In terms of two words, I think I'd probably go for jolly and research. Jolly because it is mostly a really good fun read, and you know, mentioned Jolly Japes in the plot summary, but it's got a nice sort of joie de vivre about it, which is obviously coming from the narrator himself, and we'll get into the Woodhouse elements here, I think in a few moments. And I think research, because he clearly, Ben Aaronovitch clearly has done his research on the era in terms of particularly how practical an interracial same-sex relationship would be in New York. How would that work? What would they be able to, what wouldn't they be able to do? And also just, you definitely got the feeling that, you know, thought had gone into things like the Masquerade ball and how that would normally happen, which is a real event apparently. I think he had to move the location for practical plot reasons, but it is an actual thing that did happen in that era in New York. So it sounds like we're quite positive about it overall.
Yeah.
Yes, definitely. I really enjoyed it, and I felt that it was very light-hearted in many ways, but then there were real issues underneath that you've already referred to, you know, the racism, the homophobia, Jim Crow laws, the segregation, all those serious issues are mentioned, but you've got the narrator, even just, you know, the names shortened from Lucian to Lucy and Augustus to Gussie seem to embrace the beginning, the sort of not only the class issues, but also the fun and the frivolity and the love of dressing up and the music and the balls and Tin Pan Alley and the life in Harlem at that time. It sort of swept you along because of all that.
Nobody dies, as far as I'm aware. It's very much about, as you say, about loyalty and about making the right thing happen and taking magic out of that equation if they can, comparative to everything else which has death, magic. Yes, there are spells and everything, but it is, as you say, much more positive and joyful. Not that they're not and funny, and it is very much got humour in it, but perhaps that's the issue. It's the issue of New York itself and what's happening in New York, and Gussie becoming something that he wasn't before. I mean, comparative to what he was in London, as you say, being in trouble for like knocking off hats at Cheltenham and popping champagne corks when he shouldn't and stuff like that. He actually gets his sort of magic back and actually becomes a much stronger person because of it. But he definitely has his own identity and his own place in New York in a way that he didn't feel at home in London.
It seems if he found his place in New York,
yeah,
and became himself there, and Nightingale came along and disrupted all that. But in a way, what he had to do to help Nightingale, you know, by the end, everything's much better because he manages then to be able to move in with Lucian and everything. He feels even more comfortable, I think.
No one dies until the end.
Obviously, but that's my point.
They blow up the baddie.
No, but that's it. Like compared to most novels,
there's a low body count.
There's a low body count compared to where we're going in the second book. Yes.
Yeah, definitely. I did like the fact that when they did have to shoot the bad guy, Jaeger, then Nightingale just sort of blew up the car to cover up so that they wouldn't have to face the consequences, because he realised that him being there had actually, you know, put them in danger as well.
We talked a little bit about sort of like the comedy and the humour, but Ben in the interview very much spoke about it being inspired by the work of P.G. Woodhouse. Some reviewers might think it had been too influenced. What are our thoughts on that?
The bouncing off one another, you know, with Lucy and Gussie, the characters there, and also the sort of class thing, the way they speak very much places it in that sort of genre, I guess, particularly I mean, it's partly an age thing, but it's very much a class thing, I think.
I have to confess, I've never read any P.G. Wodehouse, which may be a shocking revelation. So, I mean, obviously, I've read quite a lot of books and seen quite a lot of episodes of TV series that have been
in the style.
inspired by P.G. Wodehouse. So it's almost like I'm more au fait with people imitating Wodehouse than I am with Wodehouse, if you see what I mean. But
I was going to say, I think at the beginning in my head, when you said P.G. Wodehouse, I thought, and when you meet Beauregard starting off in my head, and that was just like not a red herring or anything, but it kind of sets you along like, oh, this is going to be like Jeeves and Wooster. And it isn't really, because Beauregard's just Beauregard and he's just a organized butler and is not really a character in the book apart from just assisting. And I wouldn't say that once Gussie gets going, he's behaving in a Bertie Wooster type of way. But you get the sense that I think it's more that he comes from the sort of like a privileged class and obviously isn't necessarily working. And so has lived in high society and is living in a different society in New York. But I wouldn't necessarily say it's that P.G. Wodehouse. Maybe I haven't read enough P.G. Wodehouse. And it is funny in the way that P.G. Wodehouse is funny. So I suppose it's that way.
one of the challenges I think we've discussed about novellas or short stories is giving depth to the characters when you've only got a limited page count and a lot of plot. How well do you think we got to know characters like Gussie, Lucy, Coco, Oriane, Morel, etc.? Jan, did you feel that they were fleshed out?
Yeah, I think I did actually. I think because they all played important role in him trying to achieve that. So I think Ben had to very quickly almost use a shorthand for who these people were so that you very quickly were able to place them. Because we knew of Molly, those of us that have read the other books, it was then easy to grasp the idea of Morel because we were told that she was very much like Molly. So I think we got a sense of her. And also the fact that he just very quickly said that when Edwards had met her, oh, you know, she never spoke. So you then sort of thought, like Molly.
Definitely Gussie and Lucy, I think you got to know quite a lot about. And I like Lucy as a character because obviously he, through his relationship with Gussie, had made Gussie the person he wasn't in England and stronger, as Beauregard's great as well, although there wasn't a huge amount of him. Coco I find interesting because she's also Amelia, so that raised the question about passing, which I found interesting in itself. And then I quite liked Oriane, the little girl, but we didn't see it until the very, very end, but she plays a very important part. But I think there was enough of them to feel that you knew the central point of the story, that the rest of the characters were very much for a purpose, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, I definitely felt that the two main characters are characters that, but other than Nightingale, I mean, Gussie and Lucy, their relationship seemed quite touching. And, you know, I loathe to use the word sweet, but you know what I mean. You felt, you know, people you'd like to meet and hang out with and sit and listen to jazz in 1920s New York, definitely.
How does the 1920s Nightingale differ from his 21st century incarnation?
Well, the main thing it added to me was the length of his relationship with Molly. Going to New York in the 1920s wasn't heading off to Heathrow and hopping on a 5-hour flight. It was a week of travel on an ocean liner to get there and back. So it just showed how, even then, how committed he was to her being happy. Some people speculate online about what their relationship actually is. I think that was interesting. Also, character-wise, he's fairly consistent with the one that we know in the modern day. What I need to remind myself is that at what point does he realise that he's got an incredibly long life? I think the two you might remember better than I do. I think that doesn't he start slightly aging backwards in the 60s? So I'm wondering whether at this stage Nightingale would have been assuming he had a normal length of life. As in, this Nightingale would not have been expecting to be around in the 2020s, for example.
One of the things I did think that was interesting here was when he was having a conversation where he was almost apologising to Gussie for the fact that he'd probably put him and Lucy in danger. And he said, I don't really understand love in that sense, but I can see that you are in love. I understand it in terms of family. So that made me sort of think that he couldn't directly relate to having a personal relationship like Gussie and Lucy did. But obviously he has great empathy and concern for characters. So I thought that gave a little bit more insight into his character. And
yeah, it's almost like if he's, incapable of love, which obviously is often a characteristic of these sorts of characters in novels. The sort of unknowable, slightly aloof characters. But I guess the flip side is that if he's entirely relying on logic to understand the world, then he logically would not understand why a same-sex relationship was not perfectly normal, if you see what I mean. He doesn't get love, but then equally his logic tells him, well, what's wrong with this? Why would anyone object to this? So I must help them, have a normal life.
Yes, it's almost as if he can recognize it in other people, but it's not something that he's actually felt himself.
No, no. But they must be quite young at this point. They must be like late 20s, 30s, if that.
Yes, because they were at school just before World War One.
Yes.
Yeah. We don't know a huge amount more about Nightingale, but I think that's probably deliberate because we know a lot about him subsequently. So he has to be quite careful, I presume, how he portrays somebody nearly 80 years earlier. So I think he has to be just the career magician and has to be the role that he plays. Yes, with those sort of traits that we know, and obviously somebody that's exceptionally loyal, like to Molly, and he becomes exceptionally loyal and supportive to Gussie and helps Gussie develop his magic and takes him on as like an equal partner, doesn't he? He's not sort of just goes off and leaves. Gussie's part of the whole story. So I think that's quite important, but it must be quite difficult to try and write somebody 60 years before knowing all the stuff that's going to come subsequently after. Because at this point, he just works at the Folly. He's not in charge of the Folly. He just works at the Folly. And he has to sort of square it to take, essentially more than 2 weeks off to go on this presumably very expensive visit to New York to do something for Molly.
And he's also obviously fond of Gussie because he says, doesn't he, before he leaves, send me a letter every now and again so I know that you're okay, and I'll cover for you that you're keeping an eye on things over here.
Yeah.
Would we be keen to see Gussie and Lucy again at some point in the future?
Well, I thought there was an opening for them to appear again because I thought intriguingly, Lucy says to Gussie towards the end, I want you to teach me magic. Yeah. So you think, well, what could they do? Both of them having the powers.
I was also wondering whether there might be a way. I mean, this is a stretch, but he could turn up in the main Peter Grant books, in theory, because we know that by the 1960s that Nightingale starts to age backwards. We don't necessarily know that won't happen to Gussie.
That's true. That could cause all sorts of complications if he does regress.
We don't know that won't happen to Peter.
But are there any other sort of contemporaries of Nightingale that we know about that's happened to? Was it just Nightingale?
A lot of them were killed in the war, weren't they?
Yeah, they killed at Ettisburg, weren't they? Or Mellanby was killed elsewhere, wasn't he?
Kind of leaving Nightingale more or less on his own at the Folly before Peter gets involved. I don't know, I'm just thinking aloud. As a Doctor Who fan where no one ever dies and everyone turns up everywhere, I'm sure, and having written for Doctor Who, I'm sure Ben Aronovich would, be able to contort the plot in such a way if there was a public demand for Gussie to appear again. It's a two-part answer, really. Yes, I would be very interested to read more about them if it meant there was a delay in having more main Rivers of London novels, then I'd rather that was the priority at the moment, which
Yeah.
he did admit in the interview that I think his next two projects are the next two main books.
Okay, both Jan and I read the physical book, but Richard, you actually listened to the book on Audible. So what was listening like opposed to reading just as you normally would?
It was fascinating. Part of the reason I did it was that when we've been posting episodes in the past, some people have put in the comments and on social media, oh yeah, why don't you do the audiobooks? There seems to be a lot of people whose primary way of enjoying the Rivers of London is through the audiobooks. I thought I'd give it a go. Because everyone raves about the guy who does the narrations called Cobner Holbrook Smith, and he was really good. He made the character very endearing and was able to sort of do the Woodhouse type voice without making it too, Hugh Laurie silly. It was a nice tone to the thing, and very good at doing some of the other voices as well. I think he's the guy who also does Peter in the main novels. So I enjoyed it. I wouldn't necessarily do it again though, because I enjoy reading, actually, the process of reading, but also I mainly listen to audio plays which have lots of characters and special effects. There's a company called Big Finish who do a lot of audio plays, and a 5 hour one person speaking is okay, but I guess the other drawback was I did get a bit confused in the middle, because if in a book you can flick back and say, oh yeah, that character, and you have a look back and go, yeah, I've reminded myself who that character is, whereas with an audio book you can't really do that. Well, we've got some feedback from listeners on the Masquerades novella, which I put out word just before we were recording. Jeanette Keane-Taylor says, I approached this one with great trepidation as a dedicated fan of P.G. Wodehouse and one who has read every book and story collection Wodehouse published. I've also witnessed many writers crash and burn on the in the style of P.G. Wodehouse hill. I was really afraid for one of my other favourites, Ben Aronovich, hearing that he was also heading in that direction. I still can't get over the splendid tightrope walk that is this book. Never ever is the Wodehouse style overdone or out of sync in this. It's a breath of Wodehouse rather than a drenching. Many of the things that are funny in Wodehouse are also funny here, with the added twist of Aronovich funny. Would Wodehouse have liked it? Not if he was still stuck in early 20th century attitudes, as there are a lot of behaviours that would make the poor man blanch. Nonetheless, it is a morality tale in its own rights, and quite a joyful one at that. I think this is my favourite novella Aronovich has written, and I'm so happy that he now and then embraces the storytelling that is possible in fewer pages. A lot of surprises, a beautiful and also scarifying picture of 1920s New York City. Masquerades holds its own and more in the Rivers of London canon.
Brilliant. Also, Jeanette Arnott, a listener, particularly enjoyed, and I quote, the social justice elements, the obliviousness of the privileged white men, Gussie being shocked and furious when exposed to police harassment, and his black friends holding him back because they know how that goes. Nightingale being warned off for drawing too much attention to the black magic community, because that will create all sorts of consequences for them and not him. I think we can all just contemplate the image of dangerously handsome and frustratingly unattainable with Nightingale in his red dress. It certainly brings a smirk and a questing eyebrow to my face. He clearly worked out exactly what to wear to the faggot ball in Harlem, despite Gussie's attempt at vagueness and obfuscation. I like that our beloved author has made Nightingale so elusive to pin down. And Janet Biddle agrees with Justine, saying, I couldn't have said it better myself, and I hope we have some more Gussie's stories. I really enjoyed it.
Okay, so it sounds like a thumbs up from us for Masquerades. So let's go back a year to the publication of Winter's Gifts. Now, Winter's Gifts does not feature the German practitioner Thomas Winter, confusingly, from the October Man, as I'd initially assumed when it was announced, but it's Agent Reynolds who features in person or remotely in a number of the main range novels. Margaret's got a quick reminder of the publisher's summary for the book.
In search of a former FBI agent who calls in a coded alert for magic activity in snowbound northern Wisconsin, FBI Special Agent Kimberly Reynolds arrives to find a tornado has flattened half the town and no sight of the former agent. Things go from weird to worse as a neighbor reports unsettling sightings, key evidence goes missing, and the snow keeps on rising, cutting off the town with no way in or out. As the clues lead to the coldest of cold cases, a cursed expedition into the frozen wilderness, Reynolds follows the trail from the start of the American nightmare to the horror that still lives on today.
Okay, so let's go with our initial impressions again. If we could sum up our feelings about Winter's Gifts in just 2 words, what would they be and why? Jan?
I think chilling and romance. So obviously the weather was a character in its own right in this one. And right from the expedition that had been hampered by the weather, and also when Kimberly gets the call up from a former agent that there was something strange happening. When she heads up to Wisconsin, she's instantly cut off by the weather. And then this continues throughout, the problems with the weather. But underlying all that, we've got a little romance that develops from start to the end.
Okay, I've got gore and grit. So gore in the sense that this was his horror novella. So you have got bits of arms, you've got monsters with heads, you've got snow monsters, you've got tracks, you've got people reporting seeing like manic deers and also all different things. And it's fairly relentless, but that's part of the genre of a horror. But I also think grit, for me, I learned a lot about Kimberly Reynolds that I didn't know about her as a person, about what she believes. She has so many things that happen to her in the space of just over one day. Literally, she arrives one morning and pretty much leaves the following morning in terms of how she responds, how she reacts, how she deals with people. So yeah, I think she's exceptionally brave to deal with all the stuff that actually happens and deal with it in such a way that it all works out okay, relatively okay by the end of it. So a lot of it is about her as she is the major character all the way through. And I quite liked, particularly I read it twice. The first time round I read it quite slowly. The second time round I read it a lot quicker. I found I quite liked a lot about her development, and I think going forward if she's used, she'll have a greater role to play given the experiences that she's just had in this novella.
I think my 2 words would be Hawkins and probably Mulder. I mean, Hawkins is a cheat because I would say Stranger Things, but that's 2 words, so I didn't want to use that one. But Hawkins is the small town where Stranger Things is set. And this very much, particularly the middle of the novella, when they're being chased by these sort of hybridy, sort of dog type, relentless monsters. It was very Stranger Things, particularly the last season of Stranger Things when they're in Russia in the middle of the winter, with the snow and everything, and it being, I think, set around a prison they're trying to break in and out of, which again is being terrorized by these sort of Stranger Things dogs. And Mulder it's obvious, and he has discussed it, this is very much an episode of the X-Files, to the extent that you could almost imagine how it would work as a TV episode. You could imagine this being a 50-minute story with the introduction, her being called into the office to be sent off on her mission, her completing the mission with a runaround in the middle, and then a denouement on the ice and a nice little romantic cliffhanger at the end. So if I'm not, that doesn't mean that I'm sounding dismissive of it. I mean, it's okay, but to me, it's probably the weakest of the 5 novellas there's been. It's still a lot better than most things. Even a slightly weaker Rivers of London thing is still very much of interest. But it was. I didn't reread it. I mean, I'm going on my memories of reading it a year ago when it came out, largely because I wasn't sufficiently motivated to go back to it, to be honest. So you guys are going to be a lot clearer on the plot points than I am. I'm still. Did they explain why Scott? Is it referenced that Scott Walker is a tribute to the singer, or is that just a coincidence?
Oh, I don't. I mean, when I heard the name, that's instantly what I thought. But it doesn't. There's no reference whatsoever that there's any link picked up.
No, I couldn't see.
William Boyd is the name of a quite famous British author, isn't it?
Yes, he is.
Yeah.
Yeah. I did think with Margaret's the historian amongst us, there were a few historical references. You know, it starts off with a reference to 9/11.
Yeah.
And then we have reference to the 1812 war and the Tecumseh's Confederacy, if that's how you say it.
Yeah.
So there are a few things there that I think people could. I definitely had to look up Tecumseh's Confederacy because I wasn't sure what that was. And so that helped a bit to place what was going on and why there was the sort of tension and anger. And just as in the previous book, you know, the things that were going on underneath in terms of relations with the indigenous people there and how badly they were treated. I did feel with this book, the other book felt to me like very light in many ways, but just because of the characters and the setting of the period, with lots of dark things going on underneath. This felt to me all very dark, with a few lighter things going on underneath. So they were quite good. I read them one after the other. So they were quite good in that sense, because you could clearly see the sort of differences between them, I think, if you read them like that.
So they're quite complementary to each other in that regard.
Yeah. And I agree with what you said about Margaret, about Reynolds, that we got to know a lot more about her, so that I feel that, if we come across her again, I think we've got much more flesh on the bones, if you like.
Yeah, I get the sense that she was mainly called in up until this point and learnt a lot from Peter. There was a bit too much of what would Peter do, and eventually he comes into it on a phone call at the very, very end, and Abigail pops up in a sentence. But I get the impression that for her, and there's sort of how it ties up at the end with Sadie and Scott Walker, that perhaps there isn't any going back for her in terms of their work with the FBI. She'll have more to do with the outlandish and magic because of this experience, maybe.
Yeah.
That would be my sense. Yeah, I mean, I learned, like you, I learned a lot. You get mentioned about 9/11. Very small character then called Travis was quite interesting.
Yes.
About how that magic is still continuing. The fact that, yes, it's all mainly about the past and what happened to this Virginia Gentleman Company and the exhibition, and they were lured onto the ice and what happened to them. And then actually they are technically the monster at the end. But it was quite interesting in terms of, you had that slightly quiet bit when they're rescued by the boy, and then she talks to Travis, and basically you realise that magic has always been continuing. We know that because she's encountered them, and she had to wake some of them back from London, didn't she, for Peter?
Yes.
But that sort of just gives you a reminder that this is still happening.
I thought it was interesting how Kimberly challenged the boy and was more or less implying, look, I get the sense that Travis isn't free to go here.
No.
And it's wrong that you're keeping him here. And he said, no, I rescued him, and it was you lot. He'd served in the Marines. And,
yes, exactly.
Side, so was trying to say he'd saved them, in the same way that he'd also said, which gave him a bit more insight into the sort of spirit world, the magic, because he said he'd been looked after by this couple who'd lost their child. Yes. I've got a purpose here, and it is a positive one, whereas Kimberly was obviously questioning, what he was actually doing.
That's right at the end, isn't it? But that idea that sort of genie loci had passed through the generations to him, because they originally talked about the exhibition being lured by a young Indian boy, didn't they, across the ice?
That wasn't a coincidence, was it? I think we were definitely meant to link that he'd led them away before they could do harm, got them locked in the cave and stuff. And then we have this sort of very similar sounding presence in modern times. So, lots of potential there, I think, and other things that could happen in the future in your view of what's going on with the spirits.
I think for me, the first time I read it, I just thought, oh, there's just Kimberly Reynolds. I thought perhaps somehow Peter Grant would turn up or something would happen. And he comes at the very, very end. He's referenced, and she references a few things. And I think part of my problem maybe was my perception of what it was going to be. But the second time round, I knew what it was going to be, and I was quite happy I knew what it was going to be. And then I actually went with it more in terms of, well, this is Reynolds' novel, and yes, it's gory, and yes, there's some bits that are just like the arm and the shed. But at the same time, I understood it a lot more and got the sense of basically like she keeps going for almost 24 hours and just trying to solve this malevolence that has been created by this recklessness of some current practitioners, maybe. But I think the first time round, part of my problem was to do with expectation, I think.
Yes. Yeah. No, I totally agree. It's completely her book, isn't it? Everything, all the others are sort of all connected to her in some way. I also thought it was interesting they were talking about the Virginia Gentlemen's Company at one point, and it mentioned the Pinkertons, and I happened to have on the back in the background Melvyn Bragg's In Our Time programme, and that actually mentioned the Pinkertons. So it was really an eerie moment for me, talking about this unofficial intelligence and national police force. But but I did need to really concentrate on those bits because it was getting quite complicated trying to follow the trail of what was happening and who was responsible and who was at one point you thought, okay, so the spirits, the bad ones, and the expedition, the good ones, and then you thought, oh no, that's not the way it's going at all. So I thought that was a good way of telling the story, because I think it did keep you sort of guessing along the way. And also some of the characters, I felt that you weren't 100% certain whether these were good people or people that could be characters that could be trusted. So I thought that was quite clever, the way he did that.
Yeah, and even with Boyd to start off with, because he just keeps on appearing. But I think he's just only interested in just making sure that potentially that she's okay. Because Scott Walker goes off and leaves her to the snow monsters, doesn't he? Bundles the other
right. He leaves her
in the car and just leaves her. And he's the one that sort of, she's up on the point with him.
And then Boyd has to come back and rescue her, doesn't he? But then that's also useful later on because she's able to use that with Scott to get some information from him, because she said, I can get you into real trouble because you left me to die, basically.
Yeah, because at the end, neither him or the librarian, who basically kind of started it, along with Mr. Bunker and Henderson, who both disappear and are part of probably the monster, she realised it's in her best interest to actually keep them in play.
Yeah. And also later, I think we're also reminded about how dangerous the magic is when she's obviously been physically affected. And Kim's more or less said, I think that's the last of your magic. And she has to agree that,
Because it sounds like she's had a similar to a stroke or something when she goes back to the library. Yeah.
Been tinkering, hasn't she?
Ben has described this as very much his horror novel or horror novella. Is this the sort of book you would normally read, either of you?
No,
definitely not me. No.
And
it's amazing when you do read something that you wouldn't necessarily have just picked up. Absorbing it can be. And I think with this, it's because you feel that that world, because we've read so many of the books now.
Yeah.
There's that excitement when you open a new book thinking, well, what's he got this time? And so it's a world I inhabit happily for these. But yes, I'd never be reading horror books.
It's a bit of an outlier, isn't it? Compared to the other three.
In the three novellas, I mean, there are moments of horror in most of the books. I think this is the most condensed, obvious horror genre. If you were describing Rivers of London to a potential reader, you wouldn't describe them as being horror.
No.
I think this is, I mean, not over the top squeamish horror, but nonetheless, it's horror and suspense. I think that's the other word he used when we saw him on the book tour for this particular novella, was that, he was about, could he write suspense? Did you enjoy the pacing of the story? I mean, it plays out across just over 24 hours, I think.
Yeah.
I thought it was a good pace. I did feel it kept you going and you wanted to know what was happening next. And it wasn't always, I didn't feel it was just a simple story. I felt that there was a lot that you had to stop and think, okay, so what's going on now? And is this person a practitioner, or is this one just coming in to try and exploit the situation? So in that sense, I think it was quite suspenseful, because you had to go further along to actually, it wasn't obvious straight away where it was going, or who were the people that you couldn't trust, and who were the ones that were trying to do the right thing and those that weren't.
No, I agree, and I think, as I say, the first time round, I think it was more that I was expecting something similar, and it was completely different. No, I think the pace is good. I mean, it's relentless, but then, as Richard said, it felt like a TV episode. It was relentless. Second time round, I was much more appreciative. The first time round, I think more is just like, oh, this is not at all similar, and I think I quite liked it better than the October Man, actually, slightly. Just because I'm not quite sure what's going to happen with Thomas Winter, whereas Kimberly Reynolds, I think, will be back.
On a second reading, you prefer it just to the...
Just about. I don't know. What about you, Jen?
I think I did too.
Yeah.
I did prefer Masquerades of Spring.
Oh, by far. Yeah, absolutely.
But I agree with you. I think I did prefer it to the October Man.
We've got all 4 novellas that are part of the 4 seasons. He was commissioned to do 4 novellas based loosely around the 4 seasons. What's your feeling been overall about the novellas, and how they fit together and fit into the wider universe?
I'm a huge Abigail fan. I found I learned an awful lot about Abigail in the Abigail novella. I love the Masquerades of Spring. As mentioned before, in retrospect, I think I prefer the Agent Reynolds one to the October Man. The October Man I found desperately interesting. I think you learn a lot about the countries that you're in terms of like their history, because Ben Aronovich does his research. So for me, I think it'd be a toss-up between the Masquerades of Spring and Abigail, probably, but probably a slight nudge towards Abigail.
I think they work. I do think they all work. And I enjoyed them all. As I was reading them, I very much enjoyed them. I think now, having read all 4, I think these 2 would be my 1 and 2.
Interesting.
I really, really enjoyed the book focused on Reynolds. And I think that was really sort of, as you say, because it was over such a limited period of time, it was quite intense. So I felt I learned a lot about her. So, these two, I think.
The October Man for us is not polling very high.
No, of the 4, I think the Masquerades of Spring was probably my favourite. Yeah. Although you've always got to be a bit careful about recency bias, if you see what I mean.
Yes, of course.
Yeah.
You read something. Interestingly, I did put a poll up online, just asking people what their favourite of the 4 novellas were. Bear in mind, The Furthest Station isn't part of this quartet, as it were. That appeared a while earlier, and obviously does have Peter as the narrator, so it kind of a bit unfair to include that anyway. And it is interesting. What Abigail did that summer had 51% of the votes. In second place was the October Man with 27%, so pretty popular. The Masquerades of Spring got 15%, and Winter's Gifts 7%.
Wow.
Well, there you go. That's interesting.
I mean, I take the Masquerades of Spring with a slight pinch of salt, because some people did admit they hadn't read it yet, which clearly the Abigail book. And I was surprised that the October Man was so popular, not because I didn't like it, but guessed that the Masquerades of Spring might come second, and perhaps will do in time. But my take on the novellas is that I think people will appreciate them more in a few years' time. Again, I have to make analogies with TV series when I'm talking about Rivers of London. And if you take things like Doctor Who or Fringe or Babylon 5 or anything that's got an ongoing plot arc, they will have episodes in the middle of a season that are tend to be standalone. And at the time, they tend to get not badly reviewed, but people are a bit frustrated because they say, well, that didn't advance the plot. Yeah, that was Doctor Who, but River Song wasn't in that one. We still don't know any more about it. Why have they gone off and done a standalone one? And often when people go back and watch them in a few years' time and aren't feeling frustrated at the fact that the episode isn't about what they want it to be about, they actually go, actually, that was a pretty good episode as a standalone. I suspect it may, and perhaps that may be why the October Man did well, because it's a few years back and people have gone back to it now and read it. To Margaret's earlier point, when you reread Winter's Gifts, you were reading it knowing what you were going to get and not think, oh, I wish it was the next main novel, if you see what I mean. So, I'm not saying they're badly appreciated now, but if you look at some of the reviews online, they tend to be a bit, yeah, this is all very well, but can we get back to Peter and Beverly, please?
Yeah.
Anyway, so if Ben is to be believed, his priority now is to get back to the main range novels, with the next one due out next July, and then hopefully, if he sticks to his 18-month claim, another one 18 months after that.
Meanwhile, if you enjoyed the podcast, please send us feedback by email to follypodcast@gmail.com or leave a comment on our website, thefollycast.com.
The Follycast theme you've been hearing is London is Inspired by Cutwater. Interestingly, it's their most streamed song on Spotify, so I don't know if that's due to our listeners seeking it out, but that may not be the case for much longer because they have a new single out just in time for Christmas, apparently, called This Will Be Our Year. So keep an eye out for that on Spotify, and we'll probably put a link to it in our next episode. In the meantime, thanks for listening.